Have you ever wondered what it would be like to design a software program? What is required of you? Where do you start? And what kind of tools do you need? But what if you are blind, visually impaired? How would you then develop software? Well, you've come to the right place. Sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy this unique conversation brought to you by the Blinded Veterans Association.
My name is Zach Tidwell. I'm a 27-year-old Marine Corps veteran, and I lost my sight 4 years ago to a suicide attempt. About 2 years into my journey as a newly blind person, I decided to drop out of college while I was pursuing a clinical psychology degree and start creating accessible software for our community. So I've since taught myself how to code and in creating apps that everyone can enjoy. People who can see can use them. People who are completely blind can use them. And I'm also working to create accessibility tools that allow people with mobility issues to use my apps as well.
What inspired you to become a computer game programmer focusing on accessibility for the blind and visually impaired community?
It actually all stemmed from my own vision loss. So I lost my sight 4 years ago from a suicide attempt. And it was a long path to regaining my independence. But I actually attempted suicide about 9 months after I was out of the Marines. So I was in college at the time. And one of my big goals after I shot myself was getting back into school. And when I did, just to try and use my own experience, I was going to school for clinical psychology. And along that educational path, I ended up in a statistics class, and nothing about the class was accessible. So that's been a very big trigger for me. Just that's something that really gets under my skin, and I wasn't in a good place at the time. And I actually ended up dropping out of college at that point and researching why my screen reader could access some websites and applications, but not others. And when it turned out that it all came down to the code in the background, I decided I was going to be part of the solution. So I started teaching myself how to code. I had never coded before I lost my sight. I'd never seen code. I'd never written a line of code. And I just started Googling. And that was almost 2 years ago now. It's the end of July 2023 right now, and I started teaching myself in October of 2021. So my apps are actually not just for the blind and visually impaired. They are completely accessible, but they're actually meant to be enjoyed by everybody. So they're completely visual for people who can see, like sighted family members and friends of visually impaired people, and I'm working to make them accessible for more communities, like people with motor impairments and things like that.
How do you approach game design to ensure that your game is inclusive and accessible for players with varying degrees of visual impairments?
That's actually a tough thing to approach, being a completely blind engineer. It's obviously on my end, everything has to be accessible via voiceover so that I can test what I'm doing. And even with that, my whole business model really is centered around getting this in front of people without disabilities, because that's where the larger market is. And that's not to say that my apps won't be accessible moving forward. That's actually to support this idea that I want my company to lead the way in terms of inclusive development moving forward. So I had a bit of a backwards approach in terms of accessibility. Out of the box, everything worked great with voiceover, but I was trying to make it visually appealing for people who could see. So that's been the biggest factor in terms of tuning back and forth between me trying to picture something in my head and make it happen via code. But because I can't see it, I have to communicate with friends and family members when they're over at my house through leading questions to try and get a sense of what they're seeing. And none of them are developers. So it's a weird back and forth process. It's kind of frustrating, but it's worked so far. And I'm working to try and increase additional settings for people who are low vision to be able to use Xanagrams without voiceover. It's an incredible experience using voiceover, but for people who have enough remaining vision to use it without voiceover, I'm trying to add additional options where they can increase the contrast throughout the app. And that's honestly a process of back and forth with people who are willing to give me feedback who are low vision. So I update the code and I publish a new version of the app to the App Store or to a testing platform, and then they have to test it and give me some feedback, and then I tweak the code again, and we do that until it seems to be working correctly.
Can you describe some of the unique challenges that you have encountered while developing games for the blind and visually impaired, and how you overcame them?
A lot of it is actually due to accessibility issues with the developer tools that I use. So, and developer tools in general. So for what I'm doing, a typical company, first of all, wouldn't just be one person. It's typically a team of developers that wear several different small hats, whereas I'm doing everything on my own, which that's just part of being an independent developer. But with that, a lot of those developers use tools that are cross-platform tools, where Xanagrams is only available on the Apple App Store right now. That's because I wanted to leverage all of the accessibility features available for an iPhone user. So I had to write code that was specific for an app that was meant to be on an iPhone and an iPad. And if I want to bring it to Android in the future, I'll have to learn another programming language and write the same app in that other language so that I can leverage all of the accessibility features of an Android phone. Most developers aren't concerned about accessibility, so they use cross-platform tools where you can write code in one language, and then the tool that you're writing the code in will export that app into different languages so that you can have it on different platforms. But none of those platforms really support accessibility. So I had to figure out a language that is really supports accessibility on the user side of things, but that also has accessible developer tools. There's an app that I have to write all of my code in that is made by Apple because I'm using Apple's programming language called Swift. And it's about 85 or 90% accessible. And Apple has done nothing to address the accessibility issues that it has, that I brought to their attention over the past almost 2 years. And it's even worse with the online tools that I have to use in terms of actually publishing my app to the App Store or publishing updates that I make. Most of that is inaccessible, and I do as much as I can. And then I call one of my parents, and whenever they are available, I will talk to them on the phone, have them log into my developer account online and click the buttons that I need them to click. And I talk them through all of that because from reading online, I know it needs to be done. It's just not accessible. And I would say the last thing is that to develop these accessible apps for iPhones, you have to use VoiceOver on a Mac. And when I started teaching myself how to code, I was only a JAWS user. So I actually had to use JAWS to read about how to use VoiceOver on a Mac and teach myself how to use VoiceOver on a Mac. And it's been pretty convoluted, but now we're here and I have a real app on the App Store.
In what ways do you incorporate audio cues and other non-visual elements to enhance gaming experience for your target audience?
I already use audible cues and actually haptic cues, so vibrations to alert users, whether it's all dependent on their device settings. If when you get inside of Xanagrams, you can turn sound effects on or off and vibrations on or off. And If both of them are on and your device is not on mute, then it will default to your device settings for your volume and stuff like that. So when you each puzzle that you go into has 6 anagrams in it, and when you solve one of the anagrams, your phone vibrates. There's a sound effect that's played, and when voiceover is done talking, if you are a voiceover user, will actually announce whatever the hint was that you solved and let you know that you solved it. And then it redirects the focus of voiceover. And it's pretty apparent to people when you've completed one of the individual anagrams. And there's a different sound effect and vibration when you actually complete a anagram, and it just presents a new screen and redirects the focus of voiceover. So again, it's pretty apparent, even if you have your sound effects turned off. You completed the puzzle, voiceover immediately focuses on the message that you completed the puzzle and your score and all of that stuff. It's all because I am totally blind. It's honestly been a matter of reverse engineering it from the accessibility perspective to making it visually appealing and usable by those who are low vision.
How do you balance creating games that are enjoyable for both blind and sighted players?
When you're designing a game or really any app, you have to think of your most limited population first. And this is just my personal experience. Again, I'm self-taught and have done all of this by myself. So other people probably could give you different approaches. But for me, it seems that because I am part of the more limited populations, if I can think of something that's more enjoyable for me and makes things easier and more streamlined for someone who's totally blind, then I can make that visually appealing for people as well. So one of the things in Xanagrams is each puzzle has 6 anagrams in it, and all of the letters for each answer are broken up into groups of 2 or 3 letters, and then all of those letter groups are scrambled at the bottom of your screen, and they're buttons. And with most anagram games, you get maybe one anagram and then it's your keyboard to try and spell the word, or it's a jumbled list of individual letters and they don't apply to anything. And none of it's a pain in the butt to try and use with voiceover. So I tried to come at this with the approach of, how can I make this easier for voiceover users? So the letter groups was one big thing. And so is the fact that every one of those letter group buttons will be used once by the time that you've completed the puzzle. So in addition to grouping those letters together, the game automatically detects when you've spelled one of the answers right. And then when you've spelled one of the answers right, all of the letter groups that apply to that answer, they're still visually visible on the screen. But they have a line that goes through the letters so that people who can see that they're disabled. But I've hidden them from the voiceover system. So for a user who can't see, all of a sudden now there's 5 less letter groups that are available to swipe through. And it's small, just convenience things like that, or adding gestures like you might know from using different audio apps like Apple Music or Apple Podcasts. If you double tap your screen with 2 fingers, it'll pause or play your music. With Xanagrams, if you double tap the screen with 2 fingers, it will actually read what your current spelling is, so that you don't have to swipe past all of the letter groups and past the button to use your hints and clear your current spelling, and it will just tell you what's currently applied to your spelling. And a lot of it is just a matter of convenience. I mean, there's a difference between things being accessible and things being optimized for accessibility. And what I'm doing is optimizing things for accessibility.
Could you share a success story or feedback from a visually impaired player that made a significant impact on your work?
So Xanagrams went live on the 4th of July, and obviously being excited about all the work that I put in and it being live, I tried to spread the word, and I posted something on my personal Facebook about my story of my suicide attempt and my journey of teaching myself how to code and what I'm doing now with my company. And about a week after that post went live on Facebook, Humanware, which is the company that develops some magnification software for low vision folks, or some magnifiers for low vision folks, and the Victor Reader Stream and the Victor Reader Trek, actually reached out to me and wants to do some sort of partnership involving coding for kids and some sort of spotlight on my app. So getting the word out to larger platforms like that is going to be big, just in terms of allowing me to create more projects like this for our community in the future. Again, Xanagrams is totally free, and there are in-app purchases available, but my goal is for people who can see to support the business so that I can keep creating things for our community and making them freely available.
What kind of technology and software do you use during the game development process to ensure accessibility?
I did a lot of research to try and figure out what would be best suited for supporting accessibility as a developer. Like I mentioned earlier, all of this was new to me. I'd never written a line of code when I could see, and I'd also never met a blind person before I shot myself. So I just kind of figured all this out on the fly using Google. So as it turns out, I did mention game engines and cross-platform tools earlier. Following that line of thought, it led me down the path of native development, which is essentially for whatever platform you want to release your app on, you need to develop in the language that is developed by whatever platform is publishing that. So for Apple, you need to write all of your code in Apple's programming language. And if you want to do Android, like JavaScript is going to be your main language. So right now, Xanagrams is only available on the App Store because I wrote the entire app in Apple's programming language called Swift. And for the interface elements, I used Apple's most modern front-end framework called Swift UI. And essentially, that's just capabilities of the Swift programming language. And I can get into as much detail as you'd like with that. If you want me to dive in more, let me know. But I do to do that because Apple is so protective of all of their devices and their technologies, and they try and keep you in their ecosystem. You do have to have a Mac to write Swift code. So I used JAWS on a PC to teach myself how to use VoiceOver on a Mac. And I started reading. And with any mainstream language, the most popular way to write code is using apps that are called IDEs, which are integrated development environments. And these apps are monster apps. There's not a whole lot of documentation on how to use them. They're extremely powerful, but they are so convoluted that they're also very difficult to figure out how to use. So to write apps for Apple in Apple's programming language, you have to use their IDE, which is called Xcode, and it's a freely available app. And again, you just kind of have to be stubborn and figure out your way through it. But I'm using a 2023 MacBook Pro. I'm using VoiceOver. I'm using Xcode, and I'm writing all of my code in Swift using Apple's modern front-end framework called Swift UI, which is essentially just an extension of the Swift programming language. Again, with that, Xcode is not fully accessible. So it's mostly there, but you can't use the more advanced properties of the language, like machine learning and things like that, because the tool itself is just not accessible. And then when you get to the point where you have a finished app, there are online tools that you have to use as a developer, and they are not fully accessible either. I've been communicating with Apple over the past almost 2 years at this point, and they have not done anything to fix these issues. So on the outside, they do put on a front that they are in support of accessibility, but on the back end, they don't seem to really care about it. It is tough. It's a large bureaucracy, and it's hard to get in touch with people that you actually need to get in touch with. But those are the technologies I'm using. And if you want to learn to code like I did, again, it was all self-taught, just reading tutorials online. And there's actually a website that I found specifically for the Swift programming language, if you want to go the route that I went, called hackingwithswift.com. And all of the tutorials on that site are accessible. Some of the tutorials do leverage advanced features of the programming language that are not accessible via Xcode. But as someone who's totally blind, that's how I started my programming journey. And now I have an app that Apple has reviewed and approved and is available on the App Store. So it's totally doable. It's going to be very frustrating, but keep at it and keep your nose to the grindstone, and you can get there.
In your opinion, what steps can the gaming industry take to promote more inclusivity and accessibility for the visually impaired?
In my mind, those are, given the knowledge that I have, those are two different questions. Obviously, from the outside looking in, you wouldn't know that. But from the game industry, one, game engines, which are probably the most popular way for developers to create cross-platform applications, don't support accessibility in terms of the apps that are output as a byproduct of those game engines. And they also don't support accessibility for developers. Not a single one. Even, I mean, there's all the mainstream ones like Unreal and Unity and Godot. But even there's one that's being created and developed by the University of Las Vegas, Nevada, that touts itself as being an accessible game engine. And then when you get to the publication end of things, the tools that they've created to publish your apps or even test your apps on either Apple or Android devices are all inaccessible for blind developers, and they have no plan of changing that. So that would be the big one on the game development side. As a developer, you can bypass those issues by developing natively like I have, but you lose a lot of the pre-established tools. So you end up having to do everything from scratch. So there's a lot of features in Xanagrams that I might have been able to pull from an existing game engine if it were accessible, that I had to create from scratch and just figure it out because none of those tools are accessible. And from the software development side, the big thing is going to be large platforms like Apple or Microsoft, even though Microsoft isn't really so much of a platform, making the push for increased accessibility in all of their tools and actually listening to feedback that they get. Again, I've submitted countless feedback requests as an Apple developer, and they don't seem to care about accessibility issues for developers. And the best way to create and attain accessible software is to have disabled programmers out there, because we're going to inherently look out for the concerns of our communities, because that's something that we need to have. And that's even, I'm totally blind and I have no mobility issues, but I'm trying to make Xanagrams usable for people who can't use their hands and have to use my app with their voice. And a sighted developer isn't going to put that extra effort in. And a lot of it's because it's mentioned typically as something that requires extra work, which isn't really true. There are extra lines of code associated with making your apps accessible, but that's not extra work because that's what you should be doing in the first place. It's legally, that is what you're supposed to be doing. It's just not enforced anywhere. So that would be my big thing, is the government needs to step up and enforce some of these regulations around access technology. And then these big platforms need to allow disabled developers to come in and help them improve their platforms for developers and users.
As a blind computer programmer, what message and advice would you like to convey to aspiring developers who are interested in creating accessible games?
So if you're not a developer already and you're interested in doing what I've done, or you are a blind developer, but you've been working for someone else and you aren't currently supporting accessibility, one huge thing, aside from Googling how you can make your software more accessible, is networking. Reach out to me. Do your research online and try and track down other blind developers. There's a programming emailing list for blind developers called program/L. That email list is not meant for people who have no experience coding. That is meant for people who have taken the time to at least educate themselves on how to code. And it's a community where those of us who have taken that step can communicate. The big thing to keep in mind moving forward is that you're going to reach impassable or seemingly impassable and insurmountable accessibility issues. And you're going to have to get very creative on how to get around those. It's very frustrating, especially for me. It was very frustrating because I had normal sight for the first 23 years of my life. I'm 27 years old now. Sometimes you have to walk away from your computer, go work out, go on a trip, go do something. And a lot of times an idea will come to you and then you follow that line of thought and that will become part of your workaround. Accessibility issues aren't going to go away for developers anytime soon, but the more disabled developers we can get in the community, the better chances we're going to have of improving accessibility for developers, which will ultimately spread the accessibility support on the user side of developer tools moving forward.
Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed this show with Zach Tidwell. It's a true honor to have him on. I'm the producer, Steve Baskus, and if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please reach out to me at sbaskis@bva.org. That's SBASKIS@bva.org. And please remember to subscribe, to rate, and to share the podcast on your favorite platform. This is Steve Baskus signing off.
You're listening to a BVA production.